You're in the Classroom with Kat Vo. In the Classroom is a podcast where we talk about all things teaching and learning, education and research. Join me as I sit down with everyday educators and explore what's going on in the field and what this means for sustaining us as teachers in the classroom. If you want to be on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me at intheclassroom.com.au. Today's special guest is Sue Webb. Sue Webb is an educator, public speaker, and passionate facilitator of sustainable work practices in education. When she's not teaching, Sue works with teachers and leaders to establish ways of working sustainably so they can avoid energy deficit, minimize stress, and have a greater capacity as professionals and people. In 2022, Sue published her first book called Teachers Cry Too, a story that captures the complexities and challenges and joys of the modern classroom. We're giving away a copy of Sue's book, and to enter this giveaway, all you have to do is listen to this episode and send us a message as to how this episode has impacted you. We'll select one lucky winner at the end of this month, so don't miss out the chance to get your hands on this valuable resource. Alrighty, everybody. So we're in the classroom today with Sue Webb. Sue, it's so wonderful to have you on our show today. Can you start by telling our listeners a bit about yourself, your journey into teaching, and how you got into this space of teacher wellbeing?
Sure. Hi, Kat, and thanks so much for the invitation to be on here. I think it's just so important that we can bring some of these conversations to teachers in the classroom, because we all know that we're in the classroom, we're just so busy, and it's really hard to get that time to kind of read the literature and the research that's coming out, particularly around now teacher wellbeing. There's a lot emerging, and thankfully more emerging in the Australian research area, which we can speak to a little bit later. But so let's start with my journey then. So I graduated in 1983. So I've been teaching for 30 years, over 30 years now, and I graduated in South Australia. And so I've been teaching in schools across South Australia and Queensland. I'm currently based in Queensland. And I suppose what led me to teaching was my love of literature. When I graduated high school, I actually thought about journalism for a while. But I'm really glad that I ended up in teaching, because it has enabled me to really tap into that love of literature that I still have, and hopefully to bring that to kids. I think I love it because it's such a cross section of everything else. You know, it takes us into history, and it takes us. It asks us to consider the future, and it talks to us about our own humanity. And I think whenever I look at literature with young people, whether it be, I don't know, what are some of my favourites? Jasper Jones, and I think we're absolutely going to have some robust and perhaps difficult and uncomfortable conversations about Australian society and our place in it. When we teach things like The Wrong Boy, we're going to look at the Holocaust, and we're going to really use that as a mirror for the young generation to say, look, the reason that we study these texts is because it's your job to make sure that something like this never happens again. So pay attention to what's happening in the world. Literature is invitational, and it's challenging in so many ways. So that's what really got me into teaching, and I think it's where I probably, after 30 years of teaching, would say on reflection, it's still where I feel the most comfortable, and probably where I feel I do my best work, actually. So I was interesting. We were just talking about Lord of the Flies. I was taking a class and we were doing the Lord of the Flies, and of course the kids are saying, "Oh, this was so long ago. This would never happen." And I said, when we talk about human behaviour and descent into anarchy, just think about the last time a relief teacher came into this classroom, and for some reason there were. For some reason, think about the kids who thought that the rules changed just because the environment had changed. Think about the kind of things that were said and the behaviours that happen when you've got a relief teacher in the classroom that would never normally happen when your regular teacher's in the classroom. And so literature is a real window into human behaviour, and I think that's probably what still drives me, I think, as an educator.
How did that move you into the space of teacher wellbeing, because I also understand that you've recently written a book called Teachers Cry Too. And how do you think that interest has really developed this curiosity about teachers and teacher wellbeing? How did you move into that space, Sue?
Yeah, look, I love the question because it speaks to the power of storytelling, which I've always believed in as a literature teacher. So, what happened for me is that I had an experience of burnout in 2016, something that at the time I didn't understand and didn't know how to manage. Unfortunately, because of that, the recovery time took probably longer than it should have. So, there was a period of about 4 years there where I really lost my way. Um, not just in my professional life, but in my personal life too. And I think what I've learned is that's the thing with burnout. It permeates every aspect of our lives if we don't have strategies around prevention and management. So for 26 years of my career, I absolutely loved what I was doing. In 2016, I started to feel a heaviness in my job that I hadn't felt before. And whilst I was having good days and bad days, which we do in every job, there are good days and bad days. I started to notice around that time that I was having more bad days than good days, and I developed a love-hate relationship with my work. And by that I mean I loved what I did every day with young people. I loved the nature of my work, but there were quite a few days where I woke up and I thought I hate my job. So I had to reconcile that. How could it be that I loved working with young people? I loved the work I did in the classroom and yet hated what I felt like the job had become. And that sparked a bit of a journey. And through that period of recovery, one of the things I did was I started keeping a journal. The reason for the journal was that I sought to answer two questions. The first one was what happened? What actually happened to me? What was this thing called burnout? And the second thing is, why did it happen? And why did it happen then, 26 years in, when I had a level of competence and experience that you would think might be a bit of a buffer? And so as a result of that journal, a story evolved. And that story I published in 2022 called Teachers Cry Too. And it really captures, I suppose, the complexity of the modern classroom and the impact of that on teachers. Because I do think that the nature of the classroom has changed, the nature of young people, the things that young people are dealing with now has certainly changed. And all of that is visible in the classroom. And all of that has an impact on teachers. We're stepping into touch points with young people that perhaps we weren't stepping into as often 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so that's kind of what really led me to an interest in understanding my own experience, but also what I've learned from that experience and how I can pass those learnings on to other teachers and other educators, school leaders included. Because what we know, of course, in our profession is that, those high attrition rates, we know that teachers are experiencing levels of anxiety and depression and stress at levels higher than the average population. I don't think we should accept that as normal. I don't want to normalize that. I want to acknowledge it, but I also want to say, hang on a minute, we need to learn, A, how to manage it, but more importantly, how to prevent it. How do we prevent educators from reaching crisis point in the first place? That's really been the impetus of the story, and the story I'm finding since it came out a couple of years ago has been a lovely platform for engaging with schools and educators and teachers about their own experience. One of the things I said, Kat, when the book came out is that it's called Teachers Cry Too, and although it's my story, it's never been just my story. I think it's the story of so many educators today, and unfortunately, teacher burnout is becoming a theme in our profession that I think we need to we need to break that cycle.
Mm. So can I ask you about burnout? Because I feel like it is one of those terms that is thrown around a lot. and it can be conflated with many different things like exhaustion or fatigue and isolated, and there might be some misunderstandings around burnout and what it is. So for our listeners, can you just unpack, you know, what does burnout look like? Like, is it different for everybody in terms of what they feel? Are the common factors, like as you say, having that love-hate relationship, or can it be, more than just a physical experience, I guess? What or emotional experience? What does it actually entail? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big question to step into, and this is what I often talk to when I go to schools and run professional development and coaching, or if I'm speaking at conferences. This is, I think, the essence of the question. I use the definition of burnout that's used by the World Health Organization, and they define burnout as workplace stress that has gone unmanaged. And so one of the things that I've learned is that we often think about burnout as an absolute. We often talk about it as people are either burned out or they're not. And in fact, it's more helpful to think about burnout as a continuum. One of the researchers that I am following and I really love his work, his name's Nick Petrie, he's a New Zealand researcher, and he's researched burnout across a whole range of organisations, including education, but also he's interviewed Navy SEALs, he's interviewed surgeons, he's interviewed priests, he's interviewed healthcare workers, etc., a wide range of different professions, and he found a number of common factors. The other thing he found is that he describes burnout as having 3 degrees, the 3 degrees of burnout. If we think about burnout in the same way that we might think of burns, if you think about a first-degree burn being sunburn, for instance, where it's uncomfortable, it can be a bit painful, but it doesn't last very long. We can treat that with self-care. It's largely self-managed. We can apply moisturizer. We can apply cold compress. And after a week or so, it's gone, and we can move on. If we think about a second-degree burn, now we're talking about a deeper level of burn where self-care might not be enough. Sometimes it can scar. Sometimes we need to cover the wound because we might be at risk of infection. It's obviously more painful, and the recovery process for a second-degree burn is going to be a lot longer. We think about a third-degree burn now, we're getting into really deep levels of burn. So deep, in fact, that there might be nerve damage. And it's quite common for patients with third-degree burns not to feel pain because they're numb. Their nerves have been damaged and they feel a numbness. So they don't often even identify the extent of the wound. They definitely need professional health care. They might need hospitalisation. And of course, in a third-degree burn, we're at risk of developing complications. So our risk levels are higher. And the other thing to remember is that the recovery time is going to take a lot longer. So if we then use that analogy and apply it to burnout, it becomes quite apparent that if somebody is in third-degree burnout and we're giving them first-degree strategies, then it's lovely, but it's useless. It's not going to help that person because that person is now, if you're in third-degree burnout and you've been there for quite some time, the level of care and intervention and the length of recovery time is going to be way greater than somebody who might just be feeling like, yes, they're operating under stress, but they've only been there for a short period of time. That stress is going to pass, and when it does, that person's going to be able to move on, and it's not really going to have long-lasting impact. I really like that analogy. It's a good visual one. I use it as a visual slide, and it helps people to be able to identify where am I on the burnout spectrum. Because if you're only in first-degree burnout, a couple of days off might be what you need. Exercise, eating well, those self-care strategies will be helpful for somebody who's in first-degree burnout, but they're not going to be enough for anybody who's in second or who's a little bit further along the burnout spectrum. You asked me about things that you can look out for, and I think that that's a very important question because what Nick's research also found is that people who are in burnout often don't see the signs. They will, other people around them will often point it out. You know, that they might point out mood swings, or they might point out the fact that the person's always working, or that they're not sleeping, or um, and I have to say, in my experience, I think to some extent that's true. I certainly knew that I was tired. I knew that I wasn't feeling the same level of joy in my work that I had experienced previously. I knew that my decision making was impacted. I knew that I wasn't bouncing back. I knew all those things, but I didn't put them together as being sick, right? And so I did what I think a lot of teachers do in my experience. We say things like, "Oh, I'll just get through until the weekend and then I'll be all right." Or I'll just push through. I've only got 3 more weeks until the school term, until the school holidays. And so I'll just push through and make it until the school holidays, and then I'll have a couple of weeks and then I'll be fine. And often I was fine for the first week or two. But what we know about burnout is that unless we're addressing those real risk factors, those stress factors, the symptoms of burnout inevitably re-emerge within the first week or two of returning to school or returning to work. So just to give you an idea of some things that people can be on the lookout for, watch for symptoms like waking up still feeling tired, even though you feel as though you've had enough sleep. You might have had 6 or 7 or 8 hours sleep, but you wake up and you still feel tired. You still feel fatigued, that lack of energy. Often language is one of the first things to go. So people find it difficult to articulate what they're experiencing. There's an inability to retain information, so memory loss becomes problematic, especially in an occupation like teaching, where we have to remember so much information on a daily basis. Being able to make decisions that you normally would be able to make quite easily in the course of your day, suddenly that becomes problematic. Becoming snappy and short-tempered. Feeling levels of disengagement and cynicism, you know, so you become, and I did as well, quite cynical about, "Oh, here's another thing that I have to do." That was frustration playing out, because in essence, what happens is when you're in burnout, you're working beyond capacity, and so your body tries to protect you. Um, and there's a whole lot more that we could talk about there in burnout, but I think that's probably enough for people to start with. One of the things that might be helpful for people, Kat, is if you have a look at if you have a look online, there are a number of mental health continuums that people can have a look at. A really good one, interestingly enough, that I stumbled across was the AFL Mental Health Continuum. And if people Google that, it actually puts in columns very clearly what the descriptors for operating at a healthy level, and then it goes all the way through to descriptors when you're operating at beyond capacity or at burnout, when you really need intervention, proper professional intervention. And I think that's a really good cue to have a look at to help you to identify, where am I? What am I experiencing, and what are some of the symptoms that I might be starting to notice, some of the red flags?
I wish I met you in my first year, Sue, because I feel like you would have been able to give me that perspective to just watch for those signs and symptoms. Because in my second year, I felt exactly all of those things. And I actually got diagnosed with Graves' disease, which is like hyperthyroid function. And that is where your body is irritable, you can't control your body temperature, your heart rate is constantly operating at, 130, just resting. And I was getting sick every single week, not understanding that I was overworking myself by, I was working full time, also studying part time, which I don't think helped at the time, and then having all these additional expectations. And in my third year of teaching, I had to go part time just to rebalance that capacity that I had overexerted during my second year. But I guess this makes me think that not a lot of teachers have that capacity to, go part-time or to adjust their working hours because of the natures of teaching and of life. So, in terms of the role of schools then for how they are to be supporting teacher well-being, what does that actually look like? Because a lot of teachers are saying, and I've read this on a lot of the groups, it's like, hey, how do we support teachers' well-being? And a lot of the comments are, should we do a game or should we do like a fun social afternoon? And it just makes me think about those degrees of burnout and the interventions that you were talking about. So I think for school leaders, what are some of the things that you would like them to be cognizant about?
Mm, great question. In answering it, I would I'd bring to people's attention that our school leaders are also experiencing high degrees of burnout. School principals, particularly, high degrees of depression. Their relationships are struggling too. So we know when there are mental health issues in a family, it's never that one person who's affected. It affects all of our relationships. And so, in answering the question, could I say I think we've seen an evolution of well-being? When we first started talking about this, the emphasis was on self-care, and it was very much the thinking that it's up to the individual to look after themselves. So we talked a lot about those level 1 interventions, those self-care protective factors, getting enough sleep, exercising, doing a yoga class, putting in place some boundaries, some time boundaries, and those things to kind of look after ourselves. Then I think we progressed beyond that because number one, the first thing that happened is that burnout was included in the WHO definition of occupational disease. The second thing that happened is that I think rightly, we saw teachers starting to push back to say, hang on a minute, I'm looking after myself. I'm doing all of this stuff, but it doesn't matter how much water I drink or how much sleep I get or how much exercise I do if the job is too big. And we started to see not just teachers, but I think workers in a whole lot of different professions say, what is the organisation's responsibility? And so then we saw schools start to say, okay, well, yep, we accept that we have a responsibility, that we are, and we started to see the emergence of wellbeing committees. And the organisation started to say, well, some schools would kind of bring in yoga instructors and say, we'll subsidise yoga classes for you. Which was kind of a move in the right direction, but again, we didn't quite hit the target. We didn't quite hit the mark because what we saw was people equating well-being with staff morale, and it's very different. So well-being committees often only achieved limited success, if any. Most of them kind of disintegrated, I think, kind of died a natural death because what they really became was glorified events management committees, and their aim was to look after staff morale and to boost staff morale. Now we've moved beyond that, and we understand. So back in kind of what I call phase 2 of the wellbeing evolution journey, we started to say, yes, there is a shared responsibility here, and the individual and the organisation has a shared responsibility. So it was shared, but it was still largely separate. Now I think we've moved beyond that again, and we're starting to see that I use the word, instead of well-being now, I talk about sustainable work practices. Now, some schools are already there. Some schools are still miles away. Really, it depends a lot on your school culture and your school leadership team and how open they are to these conversations. When we talk about sustainable work practices, we talk about leaning into connect conversations. And those conversations are around, the 2 questions that I think should frame every new initiative that comes into a school is, number 1, how does this improve the student experience? And number 2, how does this impact staff? And when we ask those 2 questions, then we do a cost benefit analysis. because the best programs in the world are not going to be very effective if your staff are working beyond capacity. You've got to have the staff ready and energized and enthused and well equipped to be able to run those programs if they're going to be effective. So I really see that the two go hand in hand. What can schools do? First of all, I'd say organizational change coming from the top down is slow. There's a trickle down effect, and it can be very slow to get that momentum. And I used to think that cultural change happened from the top down. I don't anymore. I actually believe that cultural change happens from the bottom up. And what I've learned to do is, one of the things I keep reminding myself, certainly during my recovery, this was helpful for me, is I have to accept that I can't change the system, but I can change my systems. So there are things that I've got control of as a teacher, and there are things that I don't. As an example, I have no control over how many students I have in a class. But what I do have control of is how I work with those kids in the class. And so then I learned strategies like working to time rather than to task. What I mean by that is when I had 24 kids in a Year 12 English class, the level of feedback that I was able to supply on their drafts, for example, looked different to the level of feedback that I've got time to give 32 kids. So our junior classes, for instance, went from 24, then to 26, then to 28, and the last time that the last class I had was at 32. Now, if you're a Year 7 teacher and you've got 5 Year 7 classes, you can imagine that's just not sustainable to be spending that much time drafting and marking. Basically, what I did was I nominated a period of time and I said, I've got 90 minutes on a Thursday afternoon, whatever time worked for me. I've got 90 minutes to draft this class. Whether I've got 24 scripts or 32 scripts, I've got 90 minutes. So I'm getting it done in 90 minutes. And I just divided the amount of time I had by the amount of scripts I had. So, of course, the less papers I've got, the more feedback I've got time to give. The more papers I've got, then I didn't give as much feedback. But it meant that I had 90 minutes of my time, and that's what I was giving. And it's a really, really simple thing. It's something that's based on a theory called Parkinson's law. And I always say it's the one law that I think all teachers should know, is that basically it's the theory that whatever task you have, that task will expand or shrink to fit the amount of time you've got to do it in. And so I don't have control over whether I've got 24 kids in the class or 32 kids in the class, but I do have control over how much time I'm prepared to spend on the weekend marking or drafting. So that was just one little strategy that I used. There are lots of other ones. We can talk about working to our natural productivity curves. We can talk about managing stress seasons. And so that idea that in a school, the stress seasons will ebb and flow depending on what you're involved in. Often, the most obvious stress season comes at the end of the term when assessment and reporting is due. But if, for example, if you're a drama teacher and you've got a musical that year, then the stress season for you is going to be during that time of the musical. If you're a sports coordinator, your stress season is going to come when your athletics day is on or your cross country's on. But those are your little stress seasons. And we can cope with those peak stress seasons so long as we're recovering in the off season. And so it's about being intentionally building in recovery time in between those stress seasons.
I wish I had more time with you, Sue, and I feel like we have to do a follow-up episode with you because I want to unpack all of those, aspects that you were talking about. What does recovery in the off season look like? Is the player still on the bench or are they still playing on the field but in a different position? I would love to just pick your brain, just quickly on that. Even just now, what are your thoughts about that in terms of recovery? What is the key takeaway that you want our teachers to know about recovering?
Here's what I've learned the hard way. I can give you something that I've actually learned from experience the hard way. I think a lot of teachers fit the profile of being high achievers. We want to do our work to a very high standard. We've got a high work ethic. Often we're perfectionists. And so with a personality profile like that, often what's happening for the teacher is that our thoughts, our minds are saying, keep going, keep going, keep going. Our body is saying, you need to stop, you need to stop, you need to slow down. And what I've learned is that if we ignore those signs from our body will protect itself. It will go into survivor mode. And that's what happened with me. So when I had my breakdown, I was driving on a highway and absolutely had a shutdown experience where I couldn't see and I couldn't hear properly. I couldn't move the car. I couldn't move my body to even pull the car over. I couldn't stop the car. I didn't know where I was going. What I know now is that was my body saying, you've got to stop. And it shut down almost separate to me. It was like my mind was disconnected from my body. That's an extreme event. And I think that happened because I didn't listen. I didn't see the signs. I saw the signs, but it was too late. The damage had largely been done. And the work that I do with teachers now is to say, we don't have to get to crisis point. What we should be doing is making sure that we know very clearly what those signs are, that we have a management plan in place, that we have strategies, workable strategies in place to prevent us from reaching crisis point in the first place. And one of those really important strategies is building in intentionally every day points of recovery, little micro points to reset cognitively and emotionally, so that we're not getting home at the end of the day feeling completely emotionally depleted, which is where some of the trouble starts, I think.
Incredible, Sue. You are just spitting pockets of gold for all of our teachers right now. To close, Sue, how can our listeners stay in touch with your work and learn more about this space? You've recommended some brilliant resources, but how can we stay in touch with what you're doing and learn more about teacher wellbeing?
Yep. Okay, great. So if people want to connect with me directly, you can find me on LinkedIn or I'm on Instagram and Facebook, or you can email me suewebbpd@gmail.com. One of the things I'd like to leave teachers with, though, in terms of looking after themselves and really staying connected with the purpose of their work, which is fantastic work. Teaching is a wonderful, enriching, rewarding profession. And one of the things that I think is really grounding for teachers is to keep asking themselves, am I becoming the teacher I want to be? Not the teacher my principal wants me to be, or the teacher the system wants me to be, or the teacher parents want me to be, or because all of those principles will change. The education system changes, and what they want is going to look different. And so we can run ourselves ragged trying to be what everybody else wants us to be. But what will hold us to our purpose, the purpose and the meaning of our work, is to have a strong sense of who do I want to be as an educator? And then ask, what are the enablers of that? And what are the barriers? What are the initiatives? What are the things that cross my path that enable me to continue to be the kind of educator that I want to be? And I'm going to tap into those enablers.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, Sue. We are so just grateful for your time, your expertise, and all that you've shared with us today. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and let's do it again.
And that wraps up our episode with Sue Webb. A huge thank you to Sue for sharing her expertise and insights with us today. Don't forget, we're giving away a copy of Sue's book. To enter the giveaway, all you have to do is send us a message of how this episode has impacted you. We'll select one lucky winner at the end of the month, so don't forget to send us that message, leave a review if you haven't already, to get your hands on this valuable resource. stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll dive into more fascinating topics and discussions. Until then, keep learning, stay curious, and take care. Thanks for listening to In the Classroom.